Anytime now. Cool. All right. Then Resurrecting Civility podcast, live version number 17. Unless we skipped several, which I think we probably did.
Those are subscriber only episodes.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm getting quicker. I quieted this thing before it double talked on us.
Nice.
Before we got our echo. So. Okay. We diving back in here. I did want to say I enjoyed our conversation last time, which we actually have a tiny little record of because I made this slide. I had sort of pre-made it and didn't populate it, but just to remind ourselves what it is we were talking about. And we may or may not load that up. But boy, lots happening, obviously, all these fronts. We could just continue this conversation and probably just talk about every time we met, we could probably split the topic between those two subjects, at least for a while.
Yeah.
But let's instead move on to something else for a bit, and we'll see where it takes us. Let me see if I can wax very high level, 50,000 foot, dropping down higher than the normal 30 metaphor, dropping down here. Trying to put together an account of the world, an account of ourselves, our place in the world, etc., that does a number of things, but among the things that it does is it takes seriously McIntyre's suggestion that we're really missing something in civilization writ large, writ historical. We're really missing something. We've lost something quite substantial. And of course, we really ought to read and discuss After Virtue. I know JP's jumping a bit to do that. And, but that, of course, is one place in which he elaborates on what it is he thinks we've lost and a little bit about how we might find our way back toward it. His last chapters, do I actually have that text right here? I do. And it's nice to be right when you're saying stuff that's easy to move. Yeah, his last chapter was not the way I remembered. So I would have got this way wrong, this title. It is, in fact, After Virtue, Nietzsche or Aristotle, Trotsky, and St. Benedict. So I'm going to leave it a mystery what on earth he's talking about, right? But with all of that, because there's a lot packed into that last chapter. But I did want to say that in that last chapter, he points toward the need for a new Benedict. And what he means by that, the St. Benedict reference there, is toward a new Benedict. And what he means is that somehow we need to figure out how to live together. And he's thinking there of the long rules of St. Benedict that governed monastic life for a really long time, and I suppose in some ways still do. So you need some kind of renaissance of community, he's thinking, and you need some founders of some sort, one or more founders. The way I've grabbed that whole longing, that whole looking back, seeing some possibility that's not now realized, looking forward to the hard road ahead of how we could realize it as we move, as we advance, right, to some sort of new manifestation of community, and not community in isolation, but it's going to be pluralistic communities somehow. Perhaps that's what he means, and I'm going to have to go back and remind myself when he says Trotsky and St. Benedict. Maybe he means to point out, if he didn't, he could have, right? That one could imagine a Marxist manifestation of community life, right? And you could imagine a very different, very Christian or a Christian manifestation of community life. And in fact, you need them both. You might not ultimately need them both, but you need them to be in dialogue with one another until you find out whether or not you need them both. Something like that. And not just those two, but some number of others, and who knows how many. And ultimately as many as there are that have the capacity to draw and hold people's attention for a long period of time, right? We sort of want to find these. If you want to find you really in the full minima or just a local minima, you have to find the minima, right? And if these, and here I've used this analogy before of potential energy wells that people can somehow fall into, um, and say, this is a better place. When I see it this way, I'm not inclined to change my mind real quick. This is profitable. This is fruitful. This is worth checking out. This is worth bringing help together so that we could do this together. Those kinds of clusterings need to happen. And that's, of course, what we've been talking about under a different sort of moniker or a different heading as this high information flow network of rich communities. Rich in the sense that they have this strong, they're based upon lots of information interaction, lots of interaction with the world, lots of experience, lots of people adding in and enriching them in the way people say that scientific communities do, right? So we stand on people's shoulders, et cetera, who've made big strides. Those sort of deep disciplinary scientific community manifestations of collective intelligence. We need those, but not in isolated pools and not just in one big interdisciplinary modern scientific inquiry, although that would be something, right? And movement in that direction is great movement, but we need more than that. We need um, we need to know how to live, and that has to be done through experience. And that means how to raise your children, how to interact with how to interact with the whole world, how to understand it, including the fact that people understand it so very differently and sometimes antagonistically. And what do we do with all that? And it seems like we've utterly given up on that effort. It's almost inconceivable. And in that regard, McIntyre's at least half right. We're not doing that. He's right about that part, right? Whether he's right that people were ever doing it before in better ways that we can learn from, that's a good historical question. But I think he's also right that it's not a historical question that people typically ask because it requires envisioning, aspiring to an outcome in inquiry that's really ambitious and not what we typically aim at these days. So there's the resurrecting civility 50,000 foot view. And in that view, McIntyre has what I'm calling an algorithm, right? A way of comparing these communities one to another that enables sort of mutual immersion imaginatively in one another's communities. And what I want to talk about today is what that immersion looks like a little bit. I want to talk a little bit about narrative, mostly because I came upon this paper that I shared with you two guys, and I was thinking along these ways, along these lines, quite a long time ago, and starting to think about how you put McIntyre's pieces together from not from everything, but let's see. I mean, I wasn't thinking about neuroscience, for example, in these days, and lots of other things I wasn't thinking about, but I certainly was thinking about some of the obvious things, including, and that is the immersion in Christian community that I had sort of grown up in. I think I left the martial arts out of this one, but I certainly was thinking about it, but I don't think I mentioned it in this particular paper. You might remember the other paper I did and shared with you all, but I wrote it 10 years ago on McIntyre's, squeezed it in on McIntyre's 80th birthday celebration. Lisa encouraged me to write it. I said, I don't have a paper to write for this. I sure wish I did. She said, you have to write something. So, okay. So I dashed it out. And in there, I reached into the martial arts tradition also, if nothing else, to give you a feel for what a craft could look like. That's also pretty strange to most of us in the West. Not that we don't know anything about it, but that we haven't, it looks magic. If you've seen Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, do you know this film?
Mm-hmm.
Fantastic film. And they portray lots of beauty, but when they take it to its sort of mature manifestation, it turns magical, right? There's these people flying across the bamboo trees, right? And it's magic, right? It looks like magic. And that magic is, in some ways, it probably, science can look like magic too. If you're far enough away from the maturity of the craft, it does kind of look like magic. But that's all the more so when it's from an area where you don't expect a craft, and we don't really expect a craft, that, not at that level. Um, so, okay. So what narrative then does is um, narrative is a fancy word for telling stories, and I'm suggesting that storytelling is the thread that unites a whole and keeps it together in a coherent structure. It's the difference between a heap of ideas and a coherent account. A coherent account is something that can be told, that can be shared, and it isn't just it's not just a formula. Though sometimes it can be expressed as a formula. I'm thinking now of physics or some other area, but it's more than that. It's real understanding. So you guys have all studied mathematics in the Trinity model, in which the insight from the American Mathematical Association about how you teach mathematics are all present. I should have boned up on this. There are multiple representations, right? And it's very useful to see things in a formula, story problem, in a map, in a plot, right? There's at least four, right? And you ought to be able to move from one to the other. And you ought to, and sometimes a problem falls right apart from one, right? Where you can't see it at all, the solution in another. So it has that practical manifestation, but it also helps you understand that you really know what you're talking about, right? When you can transform you might, as you all know, you could just memorize an equation as a solution to a certain problem type, but you have no idea what you're talking about. But that comes up when someone tries to ask you to draw a map or try to explain what's going on in words, right? Or write a story problem, right? Where you are actually where it makes sense to ordinary people what you're asking to solve, breaking it down. And this is the sort of thing, by the way, which Richard Feynman was so insistent on. He had an appendix to his book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman, and it's called Physics in Brazil. JP, have you seen it? I know you've taught physics. It's tremendous. If you can find that, in fact, maybe I'll find it and send it to you. He basically he describes that about physics. He describes how it is that you don't understand what you're talking about when you can memorize a formula and recognize a problem type in which you apply that formula just out of memory. That you don't yet know what you're doing. You can't give examples, for example, right? And you can't vary those examples and say what's going to happen next. You Feynman was real big on that, to the extent that he went to a physics conference in Brazil, the Brazil Physics Association, and he got up in front of them and he said, "No one teaches physics in Brazil. No one does. All that stuff you're doing in all your classrooms, that's not physics." And he said, "I must be wrong though, because I have seen this guy, this graduate student, who came through, and he said, and that guy really knows his physics, so somebody must have taught him. So there must be exceptions. And the guy was in the audience, and he stood up and he said, "No, I wasn't educated here." so, so he says, "Okay, I expected to be sort of right, but maybe 100% was a surprise." But anyway, I'm circling around the idea of being able to tell a story from many, many different facets. That is the thread that sews together things and unites them as a whole. And there's not only one way to do it. This is really quite important. In the same way that a lot of scientists will push back on the idea of the scientific method, as if there's one way of scientific thinking. And in fact, that's just not so. Some of them will go so far as to say that's ridiculous. To talk about the scientific method, and others will give a schema. Notre Dame has a very nice schema in which they do design, they do experimental design, and they break it down into at least 6 different ways of thinking through, of beginning and advancing scientific thought. You might begin from first principles. If nothing else, imagine deductive versus inductive thinking, right? Just to take 2, and that's enough said about it. My only point is, in science pedagogy, there is recognition that there's more than one way to think about these things, and think about these things from lots of different perspectives, lots of ways to proceed. And the same thing is true, I'd say, in telling stories. The same thing is true in uniting a whole, putting a whole together. But there isn't just one way to do it, but somehow narrative is essential to it. And probably not just one narrative, not just beginning in one place, but beginning in any place and moving to different places. You don't have to go here next. You could go over here, right? But all of that is what somebody with a mature grasp of a whole is able to do. So that's a long-winded preamble. I'll quit for a few minutes here, let you guys in. But I thought we could talk a little bit about it today. Let me let you in first, and then let me zoom back out a little bit to talk about our project as a whole, and where we might go next, and then maybe get to the paper.
Okay.
So,
let's see. Let's see. I guess I'm trying to understand the connection between, how a mature member of a science would be able to actually understand and articulate various aspects of something, right? So you gave the example of physics. Is that, let's see, I have some ideas, but I guess maybe it wasn't explicit to me, the connection between that and narrative. Maybe it's you're only able to do that if you know the narrative, if you have a coherent narrative that you can articulate. But I guess that would, is that really what is that the connection, or?
Yeah. Well, if what I just said about narrative is true, I ought to be able to pick up your question and begin from a number of places and go in a number of different directions.
Yeah.
Right. In other words, I'd be telling a story about how these things fit together and uniting them in a single account.
Okay.
So let me start again with Feynman and say what Feynman was saying was lacking in Brazil, which was, let me call it a colloquial insight into how the actual world works all around you, where you're constantly where you're constantly taking the principles that you know and seeing them applied, or at least asking how they apply, and not settling for less than understanding about how they apply here, right? So that you've got a story to tell about how they apply here.
Mm.
Being able to unite in a coherent colloquial whole all the things that you see together with the first principles that you think you've learned apply to the world.
Okay.
That was missing. And I'm saying that is actually an instance of seeing a narrative structure in the world. It's seeing, say, a Newtonian narrative structure in the world. It's being able to look at all kinds of problems and understand what's going on here and there, and not constantly not needing, for example, right, to say, well, gee, I don't know how forces work in this situation. We haven't covered that yet, right? Somebody who came at it from that point of view would be taking things like topics in a book, right, as opposed to principles that are at work in the world.
Yeah.
So
Would you say in that situation that they have an incomplete narrative or no narrative at all?
yeah, that's a good question. And there I'd use the reference that comes to mind, a question someone once asked me at Trinity when I passed on lunchtime basketball one time, and a student who didn't know came up and said, "What, got no game?" Some of the other students stuck up for me a little bit. Yeah, he's got a little game. But anyway, it's that sense. Got no story, right? Got no game. It's kind of like that. It's a skill set that you climb. So I would say that at the beginning you have no story, or you're an awkward stutterer, to use a phrase that McIntyre uses somewhere. No, Alan Bloom used it. That's who I'm quoting, Alan Bloom. He says, in fact, he thinks Alan Bloom's case in the closing of the American mind was that American education closes the mind to the great ideas, and he thought that particularly, this isn't the only point he makes a lot of them, but in one chapter he says that our keeping music far from central to education is a sign of the poverty of American education, and that without music that expresses what you're thinking, he says, you turn into an anxious stutterer, and there's no flow, there's no enjoyment, there's no relevancy, there's no etc. that music brings. As Bloom says, music brings unquestionable justification to the activities it accompanies. So you pick the right tune and you just sit back and smile, right? And you enjoy it. You're in the moment. It carries you right into the space. And so that kind of fluidity, that kind of flow, that's what gets expressed in narrative. That's what a good storyteller has. Right? And a good storyteller doesn't have to start at the beginning, right? That's what a good joke teller is similar, right? And I'm actually not a very good joke teller because I know where to go, but I'm not practiced in getting there. So I don't know how to dive in anywhere and turn it into a good joke, whereas a good joke teller does. And I'd say somebody who, it's because I think they see the humor everywhere. I mean, you guys have met my cousin Joy, for example, right?
Mhm.
Joy does not have hard time finding material, right? Or she doesn't have, she just sees the humor in everything, right? And doesn't matter where you start, right? And it's fun to try to keep up with her as she bounces from humorous situation to humorous situation. That's the mark of a mature, somebody who finds joy in in the world, which is one facet of telling stories. So this is a long-winded answer, John, to your question. Do they have a story, or what should we say? Their stories just aren't any good? And I'd say it kind of depends on what you think this threshold for a story is. It's both, and it's kind of like game.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, like, going back to that particular example where it's like, I've never seen a problem like this before. I don't know how to do it, right? Like, and then just not really working at it. I mean, I think if that's your, like, you need to show me how to solve this problem. Like, I think if that's your approach to a situation that's maybe unfamiliar in the specifics, or maybe coming at something from a slightly different perspective, then I don't think you have a story, right? I mean, like, maybe you, like, if you have some ideas, if you're able to think from the principles of the whatever system you're working on, and come up with some sort of interesting guess, like, then you're starting to tell a story. Like, this is how it fits into the story.
Exactly. Like, I don't know what the forces are here, but maybe they're like this, or maybe they're like this, right? And you draw a couple of bad force diagrams. Now, right. You're
and that's like,
story.
As a teacher, that's when students have that attitude, it's so exciting. Like, because then you can have a conversation. You can start telling the story together and asking them to think harder about what they think is going on. And
no, I think that's right. Where that first person you were talking about was more or less silent. I mean, they used words, but they basically were just saying no. No with an excuse, which is a kind of story, but it's not a story about that situation. It's a story about them. You haven't taught me yet.
No.
All right. So let me swing back out to 50,000 feet per minute, and really just a minute, and no long descent back down to 30 or whatever we just did earlier. Just from a real high level, if we're going to build a compelling narrative, a compelling story, issue a compelling invitation into a way of life that is put together one team, or build one building on this infrastructure, one team in the league, et cetera, to do that, me or us or anyone else to do it on any other grounds, you've got to compete with the existing stories. And whether they're broken up or not, there are existing stories. They may be incoherent, they may be incomplete, they say very little, but they say something, and people get some sort of an identity from them. And I had suggested two stories that we eventually have to get to in order to give a single tour of one of these buildings on this new infrastructure. And that single tour has got to make reference to, I would say, the American story and the Christian story. It does for us anyway, because we've all grown up in both of those stories. So at some point, looking forward now, at some point our conversation has got to go. The question will be when, but at some point the story's got to go to telling an American story and to telling a Christian story, but armed with what we're trying to bring to the table, which is really a transformation of those stories. If you don't like the transformation, you call it a subversion, right? You're undercutting those stories. You're taking what's the word? You're using them, right? You're just grabbing them and using them for another purpose, says somebody who really thinks that you're not being just, right? Or that you don't have the insight into what's really going on in that story. You're not strengthening it. You're undermining it. You're really telling a different story. It's not the same story. It's not an American story. It's not a Christian story. It's a heretical story. It's a traitor's story, right? To use languages those people might use. But if you think, on the other hand, if you buy the rhetoric, if you're invited in, if you see yourself better and you understand the American story better according to you, right? If you say, oh, yeah, that sheds light, that now I see why that's valuable. Moreover, I didn't see how to move ahead, but now I do. I see why we had this problem, why we were stuck where we're stuck, and how to remove that obstacle because of the resources you brought to bear. And you've tied those resources into the story. And I feel like we can move ahead in that story. That's not subversion. That's more like resurrection, right? Where you were really in a lot of trouble. And at least insofar as the death metaphor is applicable, then the resurrection metaphor would be too. So all I wanted to say at this 50,000 foot level is, going back there, is at some point we got to go to these two stories, and we have to retell these stories, and we have to retell them based on a foundation. And we've only partially laid the foundation. We've laid the epistemological foundation, it seems to me, this information processing foundation. And we've begun to lay a metaphysical foundation, which is a conscious realism foundation. But that's still fresh. There's still much more to be done there. We haven't even, except hardly mentioned the name of Jeff Hawkins and the thousand brain theory, for example. And I don't know how deep a dive to take there, to be honest. We could have a wonderful deep dive there.
Well, I think when we try to connect those to the American story and in particular the Christian story, I think that'll be an opportunity to get more into that as we try and connect.
I think you're right.
Conscious realism with the Christian story.
I think that's exactly right. That was my hope too. I thought I had one other thing I wanted to say, but let's move past it. But I agree. What we read for today was a paper that has some interesting threads, and one of them is it includes an approach to rethinking a story, and the story that it was rethinking was a Christian story. But not from every point of view. Although there's a lot of high information flow network of rich community allusions in here, because there's a lot of McIntyre rootedness in this approach, in this paper. But it's a much earlier chapter. It's basically a chapter which talks about how shall I put this? Well, it talks about the nature of human beings and human action and human freedom. It hardly talks about it. It mostly alludes to it. JP, you've read more, right? You've read the material that underlies this paper when you read that. I don't know if you finished it or not, but that longer piece. John Rose, I'll share that with you sometime. If you're interested, it's a paper that I wrote that basically cashes in this idea of a very different way, a compatibilist view of human freedom and human action that I make a sort of allusion to in a sentence here. I was talking to a Thomistic crowd, all every single one of them, every single person knew what I was talking about with all of that stuff. Not necessarily how it worked, but they knew what I was pointing to. So I made it quick. So I'll send that sometime. But I do think it's worth thinking a little bit about what it's like to make a transition from one story to another. And Thomas Kuhn's advice, as I characterize it here, on one hand, it's advice for thinking differently about another figure. If you can't figure out how somebody else is thinking, he gives advice for how to get into their world. That's easier insofar as their world is, as there's a right or wrong about getting into someone's world. If someone is full of contradictions, they may be different tomorrow than they are today. You know what I mean? Driven by things that they're quite sure of that are incompatible with one another. And the question is, which one comes to mind and which one drives their thinking today? And then it's very hard to say that you've got inside that person's world, because it's constantly in flux. That doesn't mean you couldn't find out that it's in flux. I think you could, and you could find out all the things that they're biting on from time to time, and you might be able to draw out some of those inconsistencies. And that's the sort of thing that Socrates made his living doing, so to speak, right? Drew out inconsistencies in people's thought. So let's see, where was I going here? Kuhn not only gives us this piece of advice, but Kuhn, much more than that, gives us the structure of scientific revolutions. Kuhn gives us this. Have either of you had a chance to read that book?
I have not. I have not read the book yet.
Yeah. It's a great read, and it's short, and it's powerful and influential. And in it, he's basically giving us a different way of seeing how science progresses. And you could say he's giving us an alternative story of science. He's giving us a different paradigm, in a way. He's talking about paradigms and how they operate inside science and how you move from one to another on the occasion of epistemological crises that sort of dam up progress in a particular line of inquiry, a coherent line of inquiry. A thriving paradigm gets stuck, and that it produces some kind of doubt about its own merits in what's called an epistemological crisis. And those become occasion for looking to other ways of seeing things. And Kuhn's point is that those jumps take place not for rational reasons. They jump to just based on who knows what personal reasons the person might have. But somebody who's smart enough jumps for whatever reason they jump to a different way of thinking about things that carries with them some substantial portion of the achievements of the previous paradigm, but promises more a different approach to problems that are solvable. And the general drive here is towards solved problems. That's the one thing that increases as you move from paradigm to paradigm, solved problems. But there isn't a linear direction, and there is no place we're going. There is no truth of the matter here. There's just movement to more and more interesting and promising classes of solved problems. And that movement is not at all linear. And he tells a history. It's not at all linear, and it's not at all progressive, except in the sense that it's solving problems, that it's accumulating solved problems, not linearly. In other words, it's sometimes you go back on some problem. Sometimes you had some problems solved and now you throw out those solutions because those solutions only worked when you were thinking that way, but you don't think that way anymore. You think this new way, but this new way has got enough problems that these guys were pretty sure they couldn't solve the way they were thinking about it, right? That people are willing to put up with the fact that they've lost some solutions to problems, hoping to get those back from this new perspective, right? Something like that. That's what I mean by not linearly, not in a steady climb. Okay, so that's Thomas Kuhn, and you might imagine that somebody who discovers that science moves from one paradigm, one whole model of the world to another radically different model of the world, for which on his account, there's really no rhyme or reason to why the one that follows it is the particular one that follows it. In fact, it might have been almost anything. It might have been some number of other things that could have led in very different directions. But what they all would have had in common is they would have increased our problem solving potential, something like that. To even envision that, you've got to be able to look at whole systems of thought and practice and see the coherence in them, see the incommensurability between them, so that there is no logical argument in moving from one to the other. There is no, what's the phrase they use at the brush up on my philosophy? There's no crucial problem. There's no do or die telltale problem. There's a nice name for this. I'm hemming and hawing trying to fix it. There's no crucial problem, which is such that both sides agree, oh yeah, that's the problem, right? Lay that experiment out, run that experiment. And if it goes this way, we're wrong. And if it goes that way, you're wrong. We all agree about that. That's generally not what happens, he says. So because that's the case, these systems then are incommensurable in that sense. There's no, there isn't any neutral ground to which you can appeal to settle the issues between them, like I was just imagining in some crucial experiment. There is no such neutral ground. And a lot of people have resisted that conclusion for a long time and thought that no, there isn't neutral ground, and science moves logically from place to place, from across what you might say eventually are something like, you'd probably then resist the phrase revolutions. Kuhn's book is The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, right? He's talking precisely about these translations, these transitions, I should say, from one to another. So these things are incommensurable. If they're incommensurable, what are the rules for coming to understand another one? You can't just advance yours to get to theirs. So that's the connection in Kuhn, perhaps between, it's no surprise he has this cool piece of advice, right? He's got something to say about how you run across, how you recognize that there's a radically different way of thinking about things, and it's not the same as yours. And it's not in, it's got an internal coherence to it. It's not crazy. You can, and you can understand it, but when you do, now you have two ways of looking at the world, and neither one of them, according to Kuhn, you have any reason to think is right. They're just plural. There's just two of them now. And already, I mean, I wonder what you think of that idea. Just to start with.
Yeah.
It would seem pretty surprising to me that even if you understood something perfectly from someone else's logical perspective, that it would be like exactly as strong as another one, which seems to be, if you're giving them both equal, you're giving both these ideas equal weight, and are you weighing them against each other? I'm not exactly sure.
No, that's really good. You're asking a great question that gets us right at the heart of what he is saying. He's not saying that you're not tugged in one direction more than another. He's saying you don't have any truth-related rational considerations for being pulled in one direction rather than another. In fact, you might prefer it because that's what your sister thinks. You might prefer it because it'd be a lot better for your career, right? You might, et cetera, right? And those things will are the sort of things that actually play. And he studies the history of science. And I can't give you examples on this point, in part because I haven't read his book in about, maybe it's been 20 years since I read it, but also in part because it's pretty thin on these kinds of details. He covers a lot of grounds, but in just a couple hundred pages. But it's probably, I'm going to presume that there's sufficient grounds in there for me to have had an example. I simply don't have one. So you'd want to get inside the mind of somebody and say, what were they writing in their journals, right? What were the problems that were keeping them up at night? Why did they actually, when did they actually adopt this? Did they adopt it after the visit at the seacoast and the party, and there were 4 other friends, and all of a sudden he was one of them? Right. And you get the impression that, and you look in his journal, he doesn't have any compelling arguments. He just wasn't making the case anymore. He's with these guys. Right. You could, if that were what you discovered, making this up now, from the history of science, you might begin this, and you found that kind of transformation being the rule, not the exception. You might begin to think that people's, yes, they're pulled in one direction more than another, but not by what we consider proper scientific or purely rational considerations. Am I answering your question?
So that was part of it. So if you remove all of your biases, and I guess and you just are looking at the 2 ideas next to each other, the idea is that they have the exact same weight, like logically, like there's no level of disagreement. That just are disparity in how strong one case is versus another, like in a slightest bit. That seems like it would be at least a relatively rare occurrence for something like that to happen.
It does seem that way. I think, to speak for Kuhn for a moment, and maybe for myself, it does seem that way when you set the case up in the impossible circumstances that you set it up in. So you started with, you sit down coldly, rationally, you eliminate, I'm embellishing your words, but I think I'm catching the spirit of it. And if I misstep, let me know, right?
Yeah.
You're impassionate, you're open-minded, you are free of bias, right? And you take them both on their merits, right? Their intellectual merits, and are waiting for some various overall strength of pull. And it's only in cases where they would be equal, right? Where you can envision some sort of choice coming into play, as opposed to reason governing which way the argument goes.
Yeah, or even that would be the case where you couldn't make a choice and you'd have to basically accept both.
Or sure, accept both or neither, or who knows what you do. You might, there are all kinds of things that you could go on to say there.
Yeah.
But one could ask, are these human beings that you envision in this circumstance? And I'm asking that rhetorically, but the reason I put it that way rhetorically is to point out that human beings are not, and never are, of the sort that you suppose they might be. They're never free of bias. They're never free of the way they look at things. They're never free of their history. They're never free of their language. They're never free of their social relationships, right? They are never a particular. They are always particular. They've always been formed in this particular way to this particular point in their lives. And there's no neutral way to form a human being. This is what you might remember in the informed desire, ideal advisor discussion, what little we touched on. This was sort of an objection, right? There's no, it may turn out, it does seem to turn out that the order in which you encounter various things is part of who you are, right? It's part of your loyalties. It's part of your, you've just got a different structure in there.
Mm-hmm.
And so you might, you might come to a spot and think that you don't have any biases. And the person next to you might think that same thing about herself. But you're both radically different people, formed very differently. And in fact, you view the matter differently as a consequence, at least in large part, and maybe entirely, right, of your formation. And so you're not really free of biases. That's the response to that objection. So the rarity that you're talking about is really a rarity. Because you're envisioning a single ground to which any person might come to, right? Which is in the same unbiased state. And the response is there is no such state.
I mean, I guess it seems like if you're in, it seems like we're in this situation all the time in acting under uncertainty, where we actually just don't know what is the right thing, and we actually can't be 100% sure. And there are good reasons for two different things, and for believing two different things. But it seems to me that the stance that works is just one of continuing to gather information, just to make your decisions better. I mean, it seems to me that that's the stance of the scientific community writ large. At least one would hope that that's what people are doing, right? So I don't know. I guess I just don't. Maybe I'm misremembering, or maybe I just don't quite understand what. I guess what I'm getting at is I don't really understand the situation in principle. Like, I guess I just don't know when you'd be in a situation where you'd have to make some decision.
Right. So I understand where you're coming from, and I think that you're looking for the right thing, right? What you're looking for the concrete circumstance in which you need to weigh in somehow and go in one direction rather than another when you don't seem to have enough evidence. You might say in the abstract, the thing to do and the thing scientists do typically say, we don't have enough evidence, right? And we just keep gathering evidence until we do, right? And then eventually we get out of that thorny situation in which the cases somehow seem to stack up indifferently with respect to a fork, choosing a fork in the road. Yeah.
I mean, you can't, but you also just can't live your life that way. I mean, like, you do actually need to make decisions. So, I mean,
Sometimes.
connecting. Yeah.
I mean, you don't have to pretend you know when you don't know.
Right.
You don't have to slam the door shut on a point of view necessarily, right? There's many times where you can say, you know what, I just don't know what I think about that. These are really hard questions, and I keep gathering evidence. I think it's going to be a long time, right? If I'm fortunate enough, right, to be able to resolve this. I mean, think about who's telling the truth about which foreign policy escapade, right?
Sure.
Things we've been reading and as background here. And you might be skeptical about your ability to really get on top of any of these things. True. Now, if you work for the National Science Foundation and or if you were on a committee that has to determine the top priorities in spending in all of particle physics, I jumped from NSF to that in the middle of midstream there, because I know a guy on that committee. And that's what he does. And what that committee does is basically look at the promise of all the science that there is out there, if you can imagine, right? In all of particle physics, astrophysics, cosmology, all of those sorts of areas are sort of competing. They're interacting in various ways. Intellectually, they are, and for funding, they are. And you've got to make decisions between them. And it turns out that these people think there's dark matter and want a dark matter camera, and these people think that there's a whole different way, right? There's a quantum gravity direction which gives the lie to the whole dark matter enterprise, that whole framework. I'm trying to float from memory to an actual case here, but just imagine I got it right. But
Sure.
yeah, maybe I didn't. Okay.
You used enough keywords that I'll believe you.
Yeah, there are people who think dark matter is not quite a thing, and they've got other candidates, right? And they're going to say that camera is entirely misconceived, right? It's like a phlogiston camera, right?
Yeah.
If you look back, right, it's a completely different way of looking at things. That was an antioxidant. Phlogiston was. I don't recognize that reference, but people used to think it was present under some circumstances whenever oxygen in fact left. They thought phlogiston was present somehow. I don't remember the details, but yeah, when you're at that fork in the road, there are people who actually have to make these decisions, and the whole scientific community has to make them, and they have mechanisms for making them, and they involve lots of educated people, but they surely don't involve, well, come back to me in a decade because I just don't see how I'm going to resolve that question. Right? They're going to be, no, how shall we spend money? We know we're not going to resolve that question unless we plan for about a decade, right? And then implement for about another decade on some of these great, on these large expenditures, particularly so when they're so expensive that the whole world has to collaborate around them, and you, in a generation, you only get a shot or two in a given area. So it may be no one gets a shot in that whole area. I mean, you can do your tiny little thing on the side, but no one's spending big money there. Graduate students are not going to go and study with you, right? Because you got this, you might pick up a few, but you got this small little theory brewing over on the side, and you don't have the critical mass you need in order to attract the funding to gather the experimental data you need. Does that make sense? That happens. Yeah. I think that's fair to say that happens in science all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And there's mechanisms for that. So Kuhn didn't address all of that. And in fact, science wasn't quite the big spendy enterprise then. In 1962, I think this book came out, that it is now. Although maybe that's wrong, because after the Second World War, there was a lot of money in science.
Yeah.
But in any case, so I don't exactly know where we are. We were just exploring this idea of Kuhn's suggestion in Kuhn's context here. Here you can, here you guys, well, actually you're in a position now to appreciate the general theme of McIntyre's 1994 presidential address to the American Philosophical Association, if I remember the year right. I think I do. And if we don't take that, you can plunge deeper into whose justice, which rationality, and the same material is there. And that material runs something like this. I think what he might, it's either a subsection of the paper, I think it is, of his presidential address, is what it takes to miss real incommensurability. And in some ways, and I don't, John Rose, your insight was a wonderful one, and I don't mean to come to in any way belittle it, right? You're setting up this unbiased perspective. but to insist that that is exactly how reason works. It gets rid of all extraneous influences and enables us to do it more, and we're able to do that more or less successfully. And that's what it is to be a rational person. That's what reason is. If you insist on that, you won't recognize incommensurability, because what you'll do is insist that these people are fundamentally talking about the same thing in different language, which a rational person can understand. And so you force them to translate into language which is acceptable to any rational person, McIntyre would say, and thus deeply mistranslate what they're saying. But if you force that, you will miss real incommensurability, and you just won't see the problem. Now, if you don't force that translation and you do what Kuhn says and take on the possibility that there really are, if come to experience radically different ways of looking at the world, where you cannot translate the one into another. I don't mean there's no kinds of exchange that can happen, but there's no fully adequate exchange that can happen from system to system, so that there remain deep differences about there emerge deep differences only when you come to understand one another the way the practitioners in each system do. You have to enter in and take these people who master this way of looking at things as authoritative about whether or not you grasp what they're saying. Don't insist that what you're really saying is, and then translate it into boxes you already have, even while they're telling you that's not what we mean. You don't get it. This is not what we say. And you say, I'm sorry, you just don't seem to get, right? That you really are saying this, because this is plain implication of the language. That's how you force people into boxes that you can deal with, these sort of neutral boxes. That's how you miss real incommensurability. So not doing that, going Kuhn's way, seeing these radically different systems on their own terms, is a first step. Now you haven't missed it. Then what do you do? And you know the rest of McIntyre's algorithm. So the short version of that is you immerse yourself in their way of looking at things, and then on their terms, seeing what you see, bringing what you see into the world which you now understand as they understand it, right? You might be able to see some things that you might be able to see problems that they are grappling with, as you might be able to see those problems differently from your other perspective, and thus find a way out even on the basis of arguments that they accept. So you might be able to see more sharply, move them in a transformed direction. I'm reminded of the transparent aluminum scene in one of the Star Trek movies where they're caging a whale. Have you seen this old Star Trek, one of the Star Trek? Oh, they're encaging a whale in this transparent material, and Scotty's mystified because he can't understand how you can hold that much water, right, in this glass of only so thick. And the engineer sits down and writes out a formula, and Scotty recognized, he said, that's aluminum, that's transparent aluminum. Right? In other words, reaching back into his bag of tricks and showing him on his own terms, right, that he has something to learn. That little moment of insight, you could imagine something like that, right, where somebody says, I hadn't thought of it that way, right, to someone who is now recognized as really putting the problem the way it actually is, not dismissing the problem by transforming the terms into something that the mature members don't accept. It's not the sort of solution You give them that sort of solution and you just argue at each other. And this is exactly what we do in our current exchanges, right? We warp one another's perspective. In fact, we don't even try to do it. Nowadays, we're so bad at it. We think there's really no point in trying. So we just insult them, right? I mean, that's what a lot of public exchange is, right? You idiots think this, right? And we're not trying in any fair-minded way to characterize what they say. But if we did try in a fair-minded way to characterize what they say, we'd be deeply frustrated because we don't really understand their whole view and we don't take the time to understand their whole view. We assume they're thinking kind of like us, only differently on this point or something like that, right? We have an easier appraisal of where they're coming from, even if we take the time to understand. And we'd probably quickly understand that that's a fairly futile enterprise and get pissed off at one another again and go back to insulting interpretations of what they think, which is typically what we throw at one another. So we're 2 steps removed from effective engagement. So that's that's McIntyre's algorithm, or rather it's pointing toward it. The whole of it is, it becomes possible that 2 people formed differently, inhabiting one another's traditions imaginatively, come for different reasons to accept the superiority of some way of moving ahead together. That may be some new tradition that grows out of the 2 of them as they exchange. That would be a lot of work, right? That would be, and the question would be, are you subverting that tradition or are you enhancing that tradition? And there will be disagreements about that, just the sort that we envisioned when we talked about future dive into an American story, into a Christian story, right? That's exactly where that stuff would happen, right? Or it could simply be, someone might simply abandon their view and say, you know what, I get that there's a better way of looking at things, and you already look at it that way, right? And so there you'd use the language of conversion and not the language of transformation, right? Or of moving ahead within one's tradition. You might simply leave it. But if you left it, you'd leave it, and the other person stays. But the reason he stays is different than the reason you leave, because he sees the world the way he sees the world, and you see the world the way you see it. I shouldn't so much say see it, I should say accept it, because you can see it imaginatively a different way that you simply don't accept yet. And the measure of whether or not you see it is whether the people who do accept it say, this is how we see it. Right? But you could see but not accept. And so for reasons you do accept, which are different than the reasons she accepts, you may come to move anywhere that happens to be the same for different reasons. That retains the real incommensurability. It doesn't get rid of the incommensurability, but it moves beyond it. And it enables rational inquiry to happen in spite of that real incommensurability. Or maybe I have to think deeper about it, maybe because of it in some way. So that's a different take. Imagine applying that to the history of science, where people jump from one paradigm to another, and maybe they jump because of their friends at the seacoast, right? And that's what everybody's doing, and it didn't seem like it's that bad of you, etc. Maybe they left for non-rational, non-truth related, non-scientific sort of reasons. Maybe they left that way, but down the road, there are resources available to them. And they can see retrospectively that, you know what, I left for these reasons, but it turns out that there are good reasons for leaving. right? Because down the road in this new tradition, you might look back and say, I get it. We're now able to solve problems and head in directions more promising than we could have done before. Does that make sense? So McIntyre need not disagree that there's the kinds of reasons in these epistemological crises, or the resolutions of these epistemological crises. Maybe that is this. Maybe Kuhn's right that there are all kinds of, call them non-rational or not truth considered or not scientific problem solving related considerations, however you want to put it. But those are not the only considerations there are. They may be the only ones that move you at the time, but they're not the only ones that you ever have. And that explains why you don't go back from your weekend at the beach, right, a few weeks later, right, or a few months later, and just as arbitrarily move back to where you were, right? You might actually have good reasons not to do that. Good reasons according to whom? According to you. Okay. So what's all this got to do with narrative? I'm aware that we're 10 minutes out and we're deep in the middle of the forest here. We've had a deeper look at, deeper look at Kuhn and thus at McIntyre in all of this. I think the stories you'll tell about who you are and how you got that way are different stories from one tradition to another. And the stories you tell about the encounters between these traditions are going to be different stories. As you roll down from your weekend at the beach, right? The stories you tell are stories of enlightenment by friends who got it before you did, right? Something like that. And it may very well be, look, I gave it a try, right? For fellowship's sake, not for any rational considerations, but in fact, it turned out to be very advantageous for me, and not just a change, but real enlightenment for me, right? That's the story of a person who comes across and develops the sorts of resources that McIntyre says traditions can develop. They need not develop those. They might simply be incommensurate and not know what to say to one another about it, right? This exchange takes time, and the way out of the exchange, or the way forward through the exchange, is a better way to put it, much better. The way forward through that exchange takes time, and that time may not have passed yet. So you might really be in the middle of a real crisis, but eventually the stories will diverge. And even the histories will diverge, right? What really happened from one point of view is this person came to see. And from another point of view, what really happened was this person jumped and left with their fellows, right? And that's what happened. And they may have something in common there, but these would be fundamentally different stories, right? One is a story of arbitrary abandonment, and the other one is a story of grateful acknowledgement, right? Or something like that. So, so you can see that in the interaction between traditions, how you got to where you are is an essential part of the story. Why suppose that you are right about what you think, that there's something promising, something attractive, something worthy of respect, etc.? Why suppose that, as opposed to arbitrary, capricious exercise of power disguised as reason? Right? Why suppose that? Well, there you have to tell a story, and you have to tell a story that is persuasive. You've got to hold your listeners. And you've got to know what they know, and you've got to be able to lead them from where they know to where you are in the story, and get them to see that this, say, the American tradition is actually it is not just the latest power grab. It's not just the Roman or the Roman Empire or the Third Reich or something else, right? Disguised as, say, the Atlantic Charter. I don't know if you've had a chance to see that, but at the end of the Second World War, Churchill and Roosevelt put together this beautiful statement of principle, and it puts off some questions that are controversial, artfully puts them off, but it does find a lot of things to say in common that are fairly beautiful, fairly noble, fairly rise of the United Nations and human rights ish things to say. Um, so yeah, I think narrative is built deep into this infrastructure. And it's insofar as we don't have stories to tell about our history, that's a sign of how broken we are. That's a sign that we are not being formed in rich traditions that are interacting with one another. Because if they were interacting with one another, we'd have a story to tell about why we're in the one we're in, and how it has been formed through its interaction with others, and there would be evidence in the telling. And the last thing I'll say is think about how people introduce themselves to one another in the Iliad. Think about the long story. It's kind of comically long, right? Where people on the battlefield come and tell this very, very long story of who they are and how they got here, right? And who they're related, etc. What battles those people fought. And what do we have that's like that? Right? And that's not a proof. That's just it's a friendly, it's an enticing possibility, right? That maybe it's
Is it that enticing?
Well, maybe it is. Depends. Telling those endlessly long stories on the battlefield isn't very enticing, but having a story to tell.
No, yeah.
Not even that. I didn't even mean that. That's less unenticing. Having a story. But I didn't mean either of those things. What I meant was the role of story playing an integral part in richer communities. Why would you think that's the case? Just because it sort of drops out of that theory of interaction that I just articulated, right? Well, you might wonder if it is the case that theory points toward the emerging importance of narrative as historical narrative, as a way in which the very evidence for your purchase on the world is located through this history of interaction and encounters. If that's where the evidence is, the story about that strings together these pearls, of these evidentiary pearls. And richer communities will have, insofar as they survive through encounters with others, they'll have these evidentiary pearls. And what I was pointing to was a particular string of pearls in the Iliad, right? Something like that, where these people are pointing toward, here's how we got here. This is who I am. Don't you understand? This is who I am, and this is why you're going down, and your stories won't be told anymore, and mine are about to be told even more gloriously, right? You might think that's not exactly the kind of conflict we're hoping, the kind of encounter we're looking for between various traditions, various communities, but it is an encounter between communities, and thus the string of pearls follows in their wake. That's what I meant by saying it's a bright shiny object to hold on to when you're thinking about this role of narrative in the interaction between traditions. It's, oh yeah, I remember they did that in the Iliad. They seem to be all about their stories like they were crazy nuts about it, right? I wonder why that is. And I'm suggesting maybe we've seen a reason why that is. Now, there's might be tons of other reasons, and it's not a proof. That's what I meant by it's. I don't mean it to be a proof. Just a bright, shiny object to hold on to as we consider this role. So we hit pretty theoretically here what narrative is, why we need it, and maybe even how to leverage it.
Yeah. I think, yeah, part of my, one reaction I have to that is I wonder where narrative falls short. Like it's definitely not a sufficient, like just having a good story to tell about why you are the way you are and why you think what you think. I don't know. I feel like it's easy to stop at just a story that you have about the world. And what's more important is the way you move forward in the world and basically your stance as you interact with the world. Like, I'm not sure how much that depends on your narrative. Maybe it does.
Right.
I don't know. I just see that. I don't know if you found a particular narrative so compelling, you might not be open to new evidence, right?
It might depend on what that narrative was.
Right.
If that narrative were the story of people who were open to new evidence, right? That's who you come from, right? So I'll make it ridiculous, but you are of the clan of people who are incredibly open to new evidence, highly successful in deeply engaged encounters, right, with all kinds of individuals. Telling that story is, it would seem, right? It's forward pointing.
Yeah.
Not just backward looking. It would be ridiculous. You'd be laughed at. You'd laugh at yourself. You would think sooner or later, right? If you utterly contradicted yourself in in between the story you tell and the life you lead.
Yeah.
And you would expect maybe to stop telling that story quite so loudly, right? If you really, really never ever meant it. And
Yeah.
think also, JP, about the way we use story in physics, because there too we're telling a certain story. We're telling a Newtonian story, and we tell it, say, in engineering. I think we tell. I say in engineering because in some ways we've advanced beyond the Newtonian story, right, in physics. But for practical purposes, it's a damn good story, right? It won't get you GPS, right? But it will get you a lot of really cool stuff, and it's just the right story to employ. And so to look at the world from that story, to see the world out of that story, and to change the world guided by that story. That's sort of what engineers do at a certain, really, at least at a bumper sticker level of understanding engineering and civil engineering, say. Well, they use GPS too, but right.
Yeah.
So then a story seems more practical, because I'm saying that is a story. That's what we were saying before. That is kind of a story. Saying, no, the world works this way. The whole world does. Not test questions don't work this way. The world works this way. Right? And when you assert that, if you don't assert it, you'll never be an engineer. Right? You'll just study engineering. So then that's I think part of the narrative is locating yourself in that narrative, locating the world around you. This applies to my world. This guides my action. This is how I get shit done. Because the world works like this. So earlier I told a partnership development story, for example, right? I said at the very start of our conversation talking about Bosco and strategic partnerships. That's in certain way I was telling a story about me. I think of myself as a partnership developer. Sometimes Lisa laughs at me. I use the phrase a hinge, something like a hinge. I like to see what these people are up to and these people are up to, deeply understand what they're up to, and figure out how they might be up to something together with these people I'm bringing also to the table, right? Something like that, and get things done in that way through strategic partnership development. And that is a story, and it's a very future focused story. I have some partnerships I can point to, and I can say, look, that's how we put that collaboration together. And it's how this one worked. And it's why, in spite of the flames, this one was on fire, right? And it looked like the ship was going down, but it didn't go down. And here's why it didn't go down, right? Short version of stories I could tell, right? When I'm looking in the past, I'm looking at those. And that's why this MOU is crafted the way it is. And that's exactly the sort of thing. That's the story I tell. When somebody says this MOU is too complicated, and I try to listen to them for a while, but then say, well, look, there's actually a reason why we're weaving these things in. If you don't, you run the risk of this thing breaking down the road. So I'm bringing an element of my story, but it's not just about me. Yes, I play a role in it, but it's a role about how the world works. Right, how human beings work, and anybody else could slot in this situation too. So I'm finding myself in this broader narrative, telling that story about me when it turns to me, but oftentimes it's not about me at all. I just happen to be a player in it, somebody who understands it and can articulate it and can enact it. Sometimes I use the phrase enacted narratives, and I just mean, see, there's that proof of the pudding again. An active narrative in that sense. It's playing out again. It really works like this, guys, right? That's so we say, right? We affirm the story one more time.
Okay. Yeah, I think I was thinking of narrative as too retrospective, I think.
Yeah.
Not as being continued.
And that's, you were thinking about it because I told it that way, no doubt. I mean, we just had more to say about it. It is forward-looking, insofar as it's an account of the world as a whole and how we ought to live in it and how it works. Then it's as forward-looking as anything. It's about the future, and in that sense, it is a computational model. Your narrative is a computational model. You put the world into it. You interpret the world in light of it. You set direction because of it. You interpret results through it. And then you look back at those results, right, as verifying or not, or at least not falsifying, as continuing. And here I'm summing together a lot of narrative language, which is why I'm talking so strange and theoretically here. It continues to look like the best narrative so far. This is the best story anybody has so far. This is how you do partnership development. This is how you do physics at the very small, very fast level, right? This is just what we know. It's what we know, right? And I put myself in a community, a scientific community in the case of Newtonian physics, right? Who knows what that community is the community of skilled partnership developers, I suppose I could say, I'm looking. It's not so well structured a community, um, but I can get a lot of heads to nod, and the ones that don't are such that they're making the kinds of mistakes that the rest of us come together, recognize, and talk about. Right? No, you don't have to do that. It's that you're way too serious. You can imagine somebody says a good partnership is just a good sale. People are going to change their mind tomorrow. You just got to sell them today. You got to get their signature and you got to move on. You can imagine, I just made that story up, but you could imagine this sort of forceful salesman blowing into the room. That's their model of partnership development. They actually do a ton of that in a lot of industry. It's a it's a famous role. Those are the people that you're tempted to hire as your salespersons because they'll ink a lot of contracts and then they move on to the next one. But they leave behind lawsuits. They leave behind maybe good first next quarter earnings, and earnings reports are good, right? But the lawsuits are bad. The the trust, the good name of the company lies in ruins, and so and that's what those of us that's the story those of us tell about those people of whom we say don't really know how to develop partnerships, right? um, so I lost my I was making a really no doubt wonderful point in the midst of that that story, but
Well,
it
yeah.
has eluded me.
Well, you were just talking about forward-looking narratives.
Yeah, that's right.
Mhm.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think we ought to run into, we got some choices, and I'd like to ask you guys to think about it. We talk about it on Monday. We could dive into, say, uh, the Christian narrative, or we could dive into, say, the American narrative. We will be forced to recognize when we need certain pieces, and we could go back and get those pieces. As you alluded to earlier, JP, with the possibility of needing a little bit more about conscious realism or needing a little bit more about the nature of intelligence or neuroscience or something, right? If you've got things to say there, how do you know how much time to spend in that space? Well, let's put them, try to get some work done and see when you need to go and grab them. And I'm really willing to advance that way. And so you could say we're at a fork in the road here. If we were going to advance, we might very well advance in one of these story directions, and eventually we'll these alternative story directions, and eventually we could advance. We'll have to advance in both of them. And
Well, I would say I'm open to going in either direction. I think we've kind of been talking about both. We've been talking about, I think the connection to the jumping into the Christian story might make more sense based on what we've been talking about on Mondays and Fridays, and jumping into the American story might make more sense based on what we've been talking about on Wednesdays. So I think we've kind of had some, jumping into either one would make sense and wouldn't be a weird sort of segue. I would say based on the jumping into the Christian story, I mean, I'm certainly interested in doing that. And I'm reading that your paper that you sent us, Uncle Tom, it's certainly fresh in my mind. And one thought I had jumping into that and connecting it to the conscious realism part, maybe this isn't actually a connection, but I don't think I really understand compatibilism with regards to free will. And that seems like an interesting thing that we could bring in conscious realism and neuroscience, and then try and connect that to the Christian story, because the Christian story makes I don't know, it's hard to understand the Christian story in the absence of free will. for me. So, or even from a compatibilist sense of free will, given my understanding of it.
That's right. It's hard to understand the Christian story without a view of free will, which is the bearer of the weight of distinction, right? The reason things are different, the reason things fail or succeed, et cetera, the reasons why there's sin in the world, et cetera, right? All of these sorts of things, all of that lays right down on the fulcrum of free will.
Right.
It's the free agent, right?
Yeah.
Who's operating in this space and causing all this trouble, so to speak, right?
Right.
And somehow it's a wonderful thing, right? So and God is willing to put up with all the other shit in order to get these, right? There's some version of Christian theodicy that looks something like that.
Yeah.
So if you don't have that, what the hell do you have, right? You don't have a coherent story.
Yeah.
That general direction of Christian theodicy.
Yeah. Yeah, like there were a couple lines in that paper that I thought were interesting with regards to, we don't need to get into that now, but anyway, that was one thought I had with regards to moving forward. Maybe that's not exactly what you had in mind.
Oh, sure it is. If we were to go forward on the Christian story side, there's a couple ways forward. One would be to take the conscious realism piece and run with that pretty directly, I think. And there you run into sort of Christ in you conversation right up front. You could also go a very different way. We could pause a little while. We could, for example, read that 40-page paper on compatibilism and discuss it. And that would probably take us a week to do that. It might take us a little longer, but it sort of depends on how hard we want to hit it. But the reason for that is you end up seeing two different stories. It's very helpful to see that you can take the same language and you can radically differently tell the story. And in order to see the story that needs to come, it's helpful to see it's helpful to see the flexibility of the concepts and the building of really different wholes. And the story would end up telling is not the same as that compatibilist story. What it's got to do with it is a very interesting question, and I don't have it all worked out, to be honest, in my own mind. Of course, I don't have all of anything worked out. There's a lot of open questions there. But I'll say this, the story you are telling, let me just say the Christ in you story, right, is a radically different story. It's as big as a sea change in your thinking as it is to move from a standard weight-bearing account of free will in that way to, I'm not saying it doesn't on a compatibilist picture have any weight to bear. It does, but all the weight that it bears is different weight. All the things that you thought you were dependent on it, they don't depend on it at all, because those things are simply not the way the world works. Just think of salvation, for example, not depending on it, which is what the whole predestination line gets you.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, the first cause is to quote Aquinas precisely, and to quote Augustine before him, although you can find this, is that the first cause of the distinction between the damned and the reprobate is not to be found in the creature. Say that again. The first cause of the distinction between the reprobate, and the saved. I said damned and reprobate, they're the same. Right? Yeah. Between the saved and the reprobate or the damned is not to be found. The reason why you're here versus here is not in there. He's completely clear about it. As if he's going out of his way to show how badly confused he is. Right? Because that's exactly where the first cause is. Everyone's sure of it. It's the only candidate on the table, right? Except not for Aquinas, it's not. right? And he's completely crystal clear about it. And he's not really, we'll put it this way, it's not like he's got this huge sea of people who think like we do, we modern people, about freedom that he's arguing with. It's not what's going on in his, it's almost as if he hasn't even considered those people yet. He's just not looking at the world that way. Okay, so how the hell is he looking at the world? That's a really interesting place to go, to step there and see it differently. And now none of that has to do on either of these accounts, as it's not at all clear what Christ in you has got to do with any of that, which is a very important Christian distinction.
Yeah.
Only dimly present, only faintly present, and here I'm quoting John Paul II, not about that point, but about the next point, only faintly present in traditional preaching. John Paul II was saying that, making that point about cosmic anthropology, the idea that cosmic salvation, cosmic eschatology, the idea that
versus anthropocentric.
Yeah, exactly. That what's being saved is the whole, right? And we're just a part of that whole, right?
Yeah.
This is not fundamentally a story about us. It's not some stage. The universe is sort of set up as a stage where the drama of salvation gets played out and then goes away, passes away, burns up, right? And we live somewhere else, which is where the really interesting living starts, right? That's the standard Christian story for a bunch of people from a bunch of different traditions, right? And that story is false on the Second Vatican Council account of it, or at least it got this big, it's missing a huge piece, right? That he's dragging in, and he's saying it must be admitted. Why? You can find it. It's dimly present in traditional preaching. You can find it in the fathers. You can find it in their letters. You can find it in, if you read the Office of the Hours, Office of Reading, I mean, and you read enough of the fathers in that way, you'll find all sorts of things said in there which sort of point in that direction. And the same is true, I'm saying, with Christ in you. I'm not the first one to say that by any means, but I am also saying it there. So in both cases, right, it's dimly present in traditional preaching, but they're two radical new additions. And in fact, it's a really good question that I've yet to explore very well. To what extent are they dependent on one another, and to what extent are there really four stories here and maybe a fifth one that brings some of these together? It's a good question. What depends on what stands and falls together with what other components is a really good question here. And this is really holistic, creative appraisal, right, of worldviews. And it's so we could start with a jump to, and I do think it's possible to jump to a place where you say, shit, that's a really different way of looking at things. Right. And it's nice if you can find a spot where you get that experience. And for that, you need to have enough moving parts that you recognize. So you can do that in some big stories. You could do it in the American story too, I think, but you could do it in the Christian story. I don't know how to do it nearly so well. I don't know what these great big parts are in the American story. I've got a clue, but not so well. In the Christian story, I think it's essential. So maybe that's a good reason why you start with a Christian story, actually, because I think it's because the American story is 200 years old. The Christian story is 2,000 years old, right? So you've got a lot more history of reflection, and you've got very rich accounts that people have put together. Whereas in our own history, you have some richness, but it just doesn't run that far back. And there are things which there are things where the story just hasn't really been told coherently yet. I mean, think of our current unrest this summer.
Right.
Okay, we've run way over typical time. Thanks for spending some time together. Let's hit it again on Monday, and we can. Yeah, why don't we just let's take the weekend off and think a little bit, and we can come back de novo. I just sort of suggested that we start in one place, but we might want to start, just because of timeliness, as you pointed out, we might want to start with the American story. What that's going to do, by the way, is force us back into moral language, very much so, because our American story is replete, right, with moral principles. And we're going to have to look at where those come from. What are they? How might they be grounded? And that's a very different way forward than the Christian story. So let's talk about it Monday, which way we want to hit.
Sure.
Okay.
All right.
Sounds great.
All right.
Thanks, guys.
Yeah. Have a good night.
Thank you, Uncle Tom. See ya.
Have a great weekend. Maybe I'll see you somewhere.